On September 7th, 1940, a high-altitude Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft traversed the skies above southern England at 25,000 feet, its Zeiss camera clicking methodically to document the mission. And as the pilot banked over Cambridge, he photographed what his briefing notes identified as RAF Bassingbourn, a critical bomber training station that had opened just 2 years prior. Yet when the film was processed and the prints reached the photo interpretation unit at Zossen, 12 miles southeast of Berlin, the analysts frowned with confusion at their stereoscopic viewers because the massive airfield, which had been constructed by John Lying and Son between 1937 and 1939, featuring 4 C-type hangars and extensive facilities, appeared to be reverting to agricultural land. Painted lines designed to mimic hedgerows snaked across the concrete surfaces between the runways, while rectangular patches displayed the unmistakable texture of growing crops, leading the Germans to downgrade the site in their target folder, based on the logic that it would be wasteful to drop bombs on an airfield that appeared barely operational. But this was not abandoned farmland, as RAF Bassingbourn was actually one of Britain's busiest training stations, housing 54 Wellington bombers and thousands of personnel. What the Germans were observing from 6 miles up was the result of a calculated deception that would become standard practice across Britain, a strategy of deliberately camouflaging military airfields to resemble the very countryside they displaced, meaning the strips of green between the concrete were not signs of neglect but of strategy, and the peculiar genius of the plan lay not just in painting fake hedgerows on the runways, but in growing actual crops in the spaces between them. Standard military thinking in 1940 emphasized hard and obvious airfields, and the Luftwaffe's own doctrine called for clearly marked facilities with prominent hangars, wide concrete aprons, and a regimented layout, a view shared by American theorists who agreed airfields should be functional first with camouflage as an afterthought, while critics argued that attempting to hide something as massive as an airfield, which often covered 400 to 600 acres, was futile since the concrete runways alone left geometric scars visible from 30,000 feet, as seen at RAF Sudbury, which opened in 1944 with 3 intersecting concrete runways stretching to 1,225 metres along with 50 hardstands and 2 T2 hangars. However, the British understood something their adversaries initially dismissed, which was that Luftwaffe photo interpreters were not infallible machines but young men working under pressure who analysed hundreds of images daily searching for specific features, and a 1935 Air Ministry report had emphasised that concealment policy need not make an airfield invisible, but merely had to delay recognition long enough to prevent an accurate attack, which in practice meant confusing the bombardier or analyst for perhaps 30 seconds as a bomber approached, a brief window that might mean the difference between a direct hit and a scattered raid. The camouflage policy formalised in 1938 rested on a simple agricultural insight that much of Britain was still patchwork farmland divided by ancient hedgerows into irregular fields, and a Luftwaffe reconnaissance photograph from 1939 showed exactly what analysts expected to see, which was small rectangular plots separated by boundary lines, showing varied tones of cultivation where fields averaged less than 100 acres, and most farms had fewer than 10 cows, creating a quilted mosaic of pasture, ploughed earth and growing crops. An airfield that mimicked this pattern, even crudely, could blend remarkably well from altitude, and the technical implementation was more sophisticated than merely painting lines on grass, as demonstrated at RAF Watton, opened in 1940, where camoufleurs created an imitation lane that snaked diagonally across the tarmac runways, while boundaries mimicking hedges were painted directly onto the grass in irregular black lines, and parts of the runways themselves received patterns of irregular dark shapes to simulate woodland patches. At RAF Yaden, now Leeds Bradford Airport, photographed on July 27, 1940, false hedge lines were painted across the runway in an attempt to break up its geometric regularity. But the breakthrough was not merely paint, it was biological. For when RAF Bassingbourn completed its concrete runway construction in the winter of 1941 to 1942, with 3 intersecting strips totaling nearly 11,000 feet. The Air Ministry mandated that the areas between the runways be camouflaged to resemble agricultural crops by actually engaging in agricultural production, which meant deliberate cultivation where the grass strips between concrete surfaces, often 50 to 150 yards wide, were prepared, seeded and maintained as functional farmland. At some stations wheat was grown, while at others the emphasis was on hay crops or short grass suitable for grass drying operations, and the variation itself enhanced the deception, because a Luftwaffe analyst looking at varied crop colours would see the natural irregularity of British agriculture rather than the suspiciously uniform green of maintained grass, although the practical challenges were substantial since growing crops on an active military station meant coordinating agricultural schedules with flight operations and safety regulations. Specified that grass near runways must be kept to a maximum of 4 inches because taller growth created hazards for aircraft forced to make emergency landings on grass. However, in the wide spaces between runways where operational necessity did not dictate otherwise, crops could grow to natural height, and a 1954 parliamentary debate on airfield food production revealed the complexity of the situation, noting that of 176,000 acres of RAF land examined, about 93,000 acres were deemed available for agricultural use, within which 41,500 acres allowed unrestricted agriculture, 26,000 acres were suitable for grass farming, and 23,000 acres for grass drying operations. During the debate, the member for Tunbridge questioned whether corn crops growing over 2 feet high might constitute safety hazards, to which the Undersecretary confirmed that wheat and barley near runways were prohibited but acknowledged that in non-operational zones, even tall crops could be cultivated, a dual use made essential by the war economy, since Britain imported 70% of its food before the war, including 90% of cereals and fats, and German submarine attacks threatened starvation. The government's Plough Up campaign aimed to convert millions of acres of grassland to crops, particularly wheat and potatoes, since 1 acre of wheat saved as much shipping space as 7 acres of the best grass in England, and between 1939 and 1941 over 4 million acres were brought under cultivation, with airfield land becoming part of this national effort. The deception worked because it exploited human pattern recognition, as Luftwaffe photo interpreters were trained to identify specific signatures like the geometric regularity of concrete runways, the distinctive shapes of hangars, the circular dispersal patterns of hardstands, and the straight lines of perimeter tracks, a methodology illustrated by a reconnaissance photograph of RAF South Cerney from 1940, where the airfield is ringed in red with numbered annotations identifying aircraft parking areas, 4 hangars, accommodation blocks, air traffic control, barracks and radio masts. Yet the caption notes that the grass takeoff and landing areas located within the lower circular section of the target area were camouflaged by painting fake field boundaries which, from the standard reconnaissance altitude of 25,000 feet, read as genuine hedgerows. The stereoscopic viewers used by photo interpreters gave 3-dimensional perspective which helped overcome background camouflage in some cases, but couldn't distinguish painted lines from actual vegetation at extreme altitude, and more crucially, the varied crops between runways displayed exactly the tonal variation analysts expected from farmland, with a wheat field photographing pale gold, young barley showing darker green, freshly turned earth appearing deep brown, and pasture grass appearing mid-tone grey-green, creating the visual complexity of agricultural land. RAF Bassingbourn's camouflage was tested repeatedly, such as when the station was attacked on May 28, 1940, by an isolated German raider that dropped 10 bombs, and from March to August 1941 as the easternmost bomber operational training unit, it came under fairly regular attack, including an incident on August 13, 1941, when a German aircraft dropped 4 bombs, hitting a barrack block and killing 10 personnel. But these were small-scale raids rather than the sustained bombardment that major strategic targets received, and Luftwaffe target folders show why Bassingbourn was identified but never prioritized. The camouflage didn't make it invisible, but it did make it appear less operationally significant than it was. RAF Tempsford provides an even more dramatic example, built at Gibraltar Farm near Sandy, Bedfordshire, where the site was initially considered unsuitable for aviation due to frequent fog and waterlogged ground. But British planners recognised these very weaknesses as camouflage assets because German reconnaissance would likely reach the same conclusion about the site's unsuitability, an impression reinforced by painting lines across the runways to resemble hedgerows from the air and disguising hangars as rundown farm buildings. Tempsford became home to the 138th Special Duty Squadron, responsible for parachute operations supporting SOE, SIS, MI9 and resistance groups across occupied Europe, making it one of Britain's most sensitive installations. Yet it maintained the appearance of marginal farmland throughout its operational life. Although the camouflage wasn't perfect and British authorities knew it, evidenced by sites like RAF Cologne, which, designated as a fighter station due to its proximity to the coast, suffered numerous enemy attacks despite buildings receiving camouflage paint that remains visible today on the officers' mess and barrack blocks. By 1941, the Luftwaffe reconnaissance section was in decline, with equipment resources becoming scarce and bomber crews complaining about the print quality of aerial photographs in their target portfolios. Yet even degraded intelligence was sufficient to identify major facilities. So what the British achieved wasn't invisibility, but confusion, as shown by a 1940 reconnaissance photograph captured by Belgian resistance forces, where analysts could identify that an airfield existed, but determining its operational status, precise layout, and priority required additional sorties and analysis time, costing the Luftwaffe opportunities because intelligence that arrived 3 days late might describe an airfield's disposition that had already changed. Camouflaged facilities forced German planners to allocate reconnaissance resources less efficiently by photographing sites that turned out to be decoys or low-priority stations, and the agricultural element enhanced this confusion specifically because it was genuine. Unlike decoy airfields constructed at sites like RAF Rawton outside Swindon, which could simulate the appearance of facilities but required constant attention as paint faded and canvas structures deteriorated. By contrast, a wheat crop photographed in May 1941 displayed authentic growth patterns and, when photographed again in July, showed the natural progression to harvest colour, a temporal consistency where crops behaved exactly as crops should, reinforcing the impression that these were working farms rather than military facilities, which was not accidental but a result of commanders' understanding that battlefields aren't sterile testing grounds. Luftwaffe photo interpreters were highly trained, but were analysing thousands of images under time pressure while searching for immediate threats. So an airfield that required careful study to confirm, or one that didn't immediately present the expected visual signatures, would be bypassed in favour of obvious targets, meaning the camouflage worked not by perfection, but by introducing doubt, based on the deeper principle that military infrastructure exists within landscapes rather than separate from them. The Luftwaffe expected British airfields to look like German airfields, industrial, purposeful and obviously military, but instead they encountered facilities that retained the visual character of the countryside they occupied, which was a strategic denial of information because every hour a photo interpreter spent confirming that a seemingly agricultural site was actually an active airfield was an hour not spent analysing genuine threats elsewhere. American forces arriving at these stations from 1942 onwards were initially sceptical, such as the 91st Bomb Group, equipped with B-17 flying fortresses which moved into RAF Bassingbourn on October 14, 1942 and coming from bases in the United States where airfields were functional and unconcealed. American crews found the British emphasis on camouflage quaint. Yet as operations continued, the wisdom became apparent because German reconnaissance of British bases was constant and accurate targeting required current intelligence, meaning facilities that appeared agricultural from altitude received lower priority than obvious military installations even if their runways were marked in German target folders. After the war, Parliamentary discussions in 1954 revealed the scale of agricultural integration, noting that of Britain's 176,000 acres of RAF land, over half had been made available for agricultural use during the war, and the Under-Secretary for Air confirmed that whilst ploughing had been forbidden within airfield perimeters pre-war, modifications to flying instructions reduced the width of grass safety margins around runways to allow additional land for cultivation, with grass drying operations becoming the ideal dual-use activity as the crops themselves became economic assets. One member suggested that grass drying, which required expensive machinery and long-term leases, should be facilitated on RAF land to maximize food production whilst maintaining camouflage, and the practice continued well into the post-war period where RAF stations designated for care and maintenance often saw their inter-runway spaces planted with crops as both camouflage and economic utilization, such as RAF Mount Farm, which, after being handed back from American use in May 1945, was kept inactive, but maintained an agricultural appearance until formal return to farming began in 1949, eventually being sold for farming in 1957 with part bought for gravel extraction in 1961. The transition from military facility to genuine farmland was seamless precisely because the visual deception had always incorporated actual agriculture, proving that military theorists who dismissed airfield camouflage as futile made several errors, primarily assuming perfect intelligence when in reality, even the meticulous Luftwaffe reconnaissance program could not maintain current intelligence on every facility, forcing priorities to be set which camouflage influenced. Furthermore, critics evaluated camouflage as a binary of either perfect concealment or useless effort, ignoring that operational deception operates in gradations where an airfield appearing 60% as threatening as it actually is receives proportionally less attention, creating gaps in coverage that become operational opportunities, and they also underestimated the cognitive burden on photo interpreters who, by 1941, were stretched thin with deteriorating print quality and complaining crews. In this environment, camouflage that created analysis delays or required confirmation sorties had a disproportionate impact, a principle demonstrated by the de Havilland aircraft factory at Hatfield, where illusionists removed part of the roof and deployed smoke canisters, leading German interpreters to downgrade it from an important economic target to one already suffering severe bomb damage, proving that while the deception wasn't perfect and wouldn't withstand ground-level inspection, it worked from altitude under operational conditions. For RAF personnel stationed at these camouflaged facilities, the agricultural elements were simply part of base life, as at RAF Bassingbourn ground crews serviced Wellington bombers between wheat fields and at Tempsford agents prepared for clandestine drops past hangars painted to resemble farm buildings, a juxtaposition of military intensity and rural normalcy that was jarring to newcomers but quickly normalized, especially for American personnel arriving in 1943 and 1944 for D-Day preparations, who found the contrast striking. One B-17 pilot stationed at a camouflaged East Anglian base wrote of the surreal experience of concrete runways painted with fake hedges and operational dispersals positioned beside genuine crop fields, with the constant background hum of agricultural machinery mixed with aircraft engines. And even the Lancaster bombers that dominated British strategic bombing operated from facilities that still appeared to be patchwork farmland from altitude. The grass strips themselves required constant maintenance by airfield construction squadrons, as seen at RAF Elgin in Scotland, which opened in June 1940 as a satellite for RAF Lossiemouth, where drainage problems from heavy flying operations necessitated the installation of a full bar and rod system in 1944. Meaning the balance between operational requirements and agricultural appearance was continuous work. Yet this very maintenance reinforced the agricultural impression when photographed because active farms show signs of cultivation and care. What made this work wasn't any single feature, but the systematic integration of deception into airfield design from 1938 onwards, combining paint and crops with irregular layout, dispersed facilities, camouflaged buildings, and the natural tendency of the British landscape to subdivide into small, irregular fields, creating visual complexity that even skilled photo interpreters struggled to process quickly. So while the Luftwaffe expected airfields to announce themselves, the RAF built airfields that whispered. This wasn't technological sophistication, but conceptual sophistication, understanding that concealment is about controlling what the enemy sees and when they see it. For if camouflage delayed recognition of RAF Bassingbourn by even 3 reconnaissance missions, requiring the Luftwaffe to photograph it in May, June and July to establish current status, that consumed resources like fuel, aircrew hours, and analysis time, which, multiplied across dozens of stations, created a substantial cumulative intelligence burden. More crucially, delayed or uncertain intelligence meant bombing raids were planned against outdated information. So attackers arriving in June based on April intelligence would find reality didn't match their briefing folders, a fact confirmed by personnel at Bassingbourn, RAF Elgin, and other stations who lived through raids that were inaccurate, poorly timed, or inexplicably light relative to the site's importance, proving the camouflage degraded attack effectiveness. By 1943, when Allied air superiority over Europe was established, many camouflage precautions were relaxed as the need for deception diminished with the collapse of Luftwaffe reconnaissance capacity. Yet the infrastructure remained, and post-war aerial photographs show the ghostly outlines of painted hedgerows fading on concrete and inter-runway strips reverting to genuine agricultural use, a strange hybrid landscape where military necessity had briefly coexisted with rural disguise. Luftwaffe records declassified in 1974 revealed the success, showing target folders where British airfields were identified but misassessed, photo interpretation notes recording uncertainty about operational status, and intelligence summaries prioritizing obvious targets over camouflaged facilities, such as the de Havilland factory being downgraded and RAF Tempsford appearing as marginal farmland while hosting Britain's most secret aviation operations. While modern analysts with digital tools can easily identify the deceptions, Luftwaffe interpreters in 1940 to 1943 had stereoscopic viewers and time pressure. So in that environment, an airfield that displayed the visual complexity of rural England rather than the geometric clarity of military infrastructure introduced doubt, and doubt in intelligence work means delay, resource misallocation, and strategic advantage. The RAF didn't grow crops on their airfields despite military necessity, but because of it, making every acre between runways simultaneously food production, camouflage, and deception. So every Luftwaffe analyst who saw farmland was seeing exactly what British camoufleurs intended. A landscape that didn't scream for attention, effectively weaponizing the very landscape Britain had cultivated for centuries by turning medieval hedgerows into painted deceptions and crops into visual shields, proving that the pastoral countryside was modern warfare's most effective concealment because German pilots looked down and saw fields, which was right, but also wrong, as that wheat might surround a bomber station and that pasture might conceal aircraft, meaning the crops grew and the aircraft flew while the Luftwaffe, for crucial months, couldn't always tell the difference.